But before we get to that, I'm thinking the movie business has had its own problems to iron out, and I'm wondering about the airline business. That's what I'm trying to say. And now this is probably a bit alien to us because our airline service has been pretty steady, meaning the same folks have been here for a good while, but that doesn't mean we're not affected by what happens. And I was, I will confess, Father, I was not aware that JetBlue and Spirit were trying to merge. And our guest says, no, don't do that. Don't let them do that. My guest is Rachel Chiu, who is resident fellow at the Committee for Justice. And where is the Committee for Justice? That sounds like a Justice League movie kind of thing. Committee for Justice.
Well, it's based in Washington, D.C.
Oh, you're there in the liver of the beast. Why have JetBlue and Spirit, who do not serve us, why do they want to merge, and why do you think that's a bad idea?
So actually, I think it's a good idea. I think it's something that should be allowed to proceed. And so for the two carriers, their thinking is that by combining that they can pose a stronger force against the larger legacy airlines. So that's the American Airlines, United, Delta, and Southwest. But what we're seeing right now, what happened last week, was that the Biden administration filed a lawsuit to block this merger between JetBlue and Spirit. And ultimately, I think that this is the wrong decision because if the two parties are allowed to merge, then it would be good for consumers.
I think one of these foundational assumptions of capitalism is that competition brings out the best for everybody, for the competitors and also for the people who purchase whatever it is they're fighting over. Why would that not be the case here, such that merging would be a better alternative?
Yeah. So something that's unique about the airline industry is that it's a very capital-intensive market, right? Yeah. So it's not like someone off the street could say, hey, I want to start an airline, right? It doesn't really work that way. And so for a company to be successful, they need a lot of resources. And for a small company who wants to get to that point on its own, it's very difficult. And so mergers like this are actually beneficial because they enable the companies to join resources so that they can actually be a larger, more competitive company.
Well, taken to its, I should reintroduce you. Rachel Chiu is a resident fellow at the Committee for Justice, and she's probably not that long out of college, but she's mature in her outlook. She thinks a lot about competition and the makeup of a modern economy and society. I think we need more competition. We've allowed too much consolidation in a lot of industries, but the airline industry in some ways, Ms. Chiu, has struck me as a little bit different because the cash needs are so great. And I mean, it's a capitalist model, but I don't think they typically sit around with bunches of cash like Apple, right? Apple has how many billions in the bank that they can spend on something, but airlines don't seem to have that. And we're competing against government-owned airlines in other countries and sometimes in this country too. Why not just keep them apart, make them stay apart, and may the best one win?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that if the parties wanted to be separate, right, if they thought that they could compete better on their own, then that's fine, right? But what we see here are two parties who believe that they would be stronger together. And to me, I don't see any issue with that. What it seems to be the case is that the Justice Department is prioritizing the quantity of players in the airline industry more so than the competitive strength of the market as a whole.
Oh, So they're looking at how many airlines there are rather than something else. Huh.
Yeah. So one of the biggest complaints from the Justice Department is that this deal would get rid of a fast-growing, ultra-low-cost carrier. And so they're concerned about Spirit just not operating anymore, less so about what the impact will be from the deal itself.
What's the one of the I'm barely remember airlines as totally regulated operations, and I remember when, and I guess there was in some ways regulated like monopolies in a way, as I understand the regulation of monopolies. What's the argument against more government involvement in the airline business, since now we're so dependent on airlines to travel around the country and then travel to other countries? And what's the argument against more government involvement, such that it, what's the word, takes the sharp edges off the combat, the capitalist combat?
Yeah, well, I think the argument against more regulation is probably the same as what we would see in other industries. So the Justice Department using antitrust to try to break up this merger is very much like what we see elsewhere, right? There's been a lot of antitrust cases in the technology sector, perhaps not warranted as well. But at the end of the day, the government is ill-suited to plan what the economy looks like. I think the free market is a little bit better at that. And that's the issue we're seeing here.
What's the timeline for, and this is, I'm not sure exactly how to ask the question, to phrase the question, but JetBlue and Spirit, two low-cost carriers, where do they serve? What's the heart of their markets?
So for JetBlue, they have a big regional presence in New York and Boston. And actually, one of the concessions that JetBlue made to try to appease regulators, although unsuccessful, was that they would sell off Spirit's holdings in those two areas so that the company would not grow any larger in those regions. That obviously didn't work, but for JetBlue, I think the benefit of this merger is more so that they would have a larger presence nationwide, less so to have a bigger presence in a particular region, which is, I think, actually very important here, because if we're talking about JetBlue having like insurmountable advantages because of this merger, that's not really the case, not nationally and not locally as well.
Now, this may be something you can't answer because it's I couldn't answer it, but I remember a time when we had regional airlines, and there were airlines for the Northeast. There were airlines that served the Eastern Seaboard. There was a Western Air. Air Alaska was, I think, designed to get people to and from Alaska. Can a regional airline survive now, I wonder? These are sort of regional, but I think they're not quite as regional as I'm talking about.
I think, so my personal belief is I think a regional airline could survive in today's market, right? Because I think what they're looking at, what they're trying to cover is a little bit different than I think what JetBlue's mission here is. I think JetBlue would like to be a competitive force against the largest four airlines and have a national presence instead of just a regional one. But there's room for both, you know, and I don't think that the national airlines, the ones that we're referring to, the ones that have 80% of the market, are going to crowd out necessarily the small guys.
Do JetBlue and Spirit fly abroad? Do they fly to Canada, Mexico, or Europe, you know?
That's a good question. I am not entirely sure about that.
Well, if you have a few hours to kill, go to individual airlines' websites and try to find, because it's always hard to find. In some cases, I cannot find it. It's the map of where they fly, right? So you'll see it's not just listing the cities, but it shows the routes. I'm kind of fascinated by it, and but for whatever reason, they tend to bury it on their websites. When will the government? When will the decision be made on whether JetBlue and Spirit can merge?
Mm-hmm. So right now, as it stands, the Justice Department filed that lawsuit last week. So this case is going to proceed through the courts, and I guess we'll just have to wait and see. But we'll certainly hear a lot more about this in the coming year.
Thank you very much, Rachel Chiu. We appreciate it. Perhaps we'll talk again. She is a resident fellow at the Committee for Justice. She thinks a lot about, as you can tell, competition, technology, regulatory policy, which controls a lot more of our lives than we know. You're listening to the 956 Drive Home on 710 KURV.